in the context of automation, there are some ways or methodologies that we are inherently integrated inside of iLogic and then the Inventor API as well to leverage using iParts and iAssembly. So let's take a quick look at some of those things. First with iLogic. So we can find a row within a table that we want to use. We can change a row. We can access the values from a particular row within the table of our iParts and our iParts or iAssemblies. We can get the row name, and we can add an iPart with iLogic to an assembly. So perhaps we want to swap in components. We have the opportunity to go out to our repository where we have our files, bring in an iPart, and then we can then define which row within that iPart we want to use. So going back over to Inventor, let's take a look at that. So here I have my iPart. Here is an assembly that I created many years ago, and we have some bearing blocks in here. This PB920, we have number 1 and number 2. I also have a rule, an iLogic rule, that controls that bearing size. So if I go into this iLogic rule, you'll see that I have some code written here that's basically I'm finding the row within my iPart where the ID parameter equals a specific value. And I'm using a user parameter inside of this file to define that. So from this upper level assembly, I'm setting the bearing bore value, and then I'm pushing that value down to the iPart, and then iLogic here will then change that iPart to the appropriate row. Okay. So inside of my iLogic browser here, I have this iParts section where, as I showed you in the PowerPoint, I can change a row. So what does that look like if I need to change a row? iPart.changeRow, all I needed to define is the iPart that I want to change, and then what row do I want to change it to? Find row, maybe I need to find a row very similar to what I have in my code there. All I need to define is what component do I want to access? What's the value or the parameter or property column? And then what's the value that I want to change it to? Now, you'll notice that I can use different operators here. If I want to use equal, if it's greater than, if it's less than. So I have some flexibility of how I find that row or what mechanism I use to arrive at a value to find a specific row. Current row value, same concept. I want to grab a value from the current row of a very specific column, either a property value or a parameter value that I can use within my automation later on. Row name, row number. So as we go through these, you can see that we have some very specific functionality that we can leverage in order to work with our iParts here inside of iLogic. Okay. For iAssemblies, there's not a lot, but it's very similar in nature. So really for iAssemblies, all we need to do is we can identify, we'll use these same snippets. It's just when it comes to the component name, we're going to be identifying an iAssembly file as opposed to an iPart. As you can see in the header here, it says change the current row of an iPart or iAssembly. So don't get confused inside of iLogic. You use it inside of iLogic and you say, well, I want to change a row in an iAssembly, but my code here says iPart. It's okay. It's the same functionality. It's the same code syntax. We just need to identify a component here that's not an iPart, an iAssembly. iLogic will understand the difference. So don't be concerned there. So, in all actuality, inside of iLogic here, this should say iParts/iAssemblies because it works the same for both. Okay. When working with assemblies here, I can work with iLogic assemblies and components. So this is newer functionality. I think this was introduced in 2018, perhaps. So very new code snippets here for managing different components, adding iParts. So this is the code block in which we would use to add an iPart to an existing assembly. So Why would we even want to do that? I mean, if we're using our regular assemblies and we're just changing the configuration, like in the context of this assembly right here, I have my assembly defined. I just need to change the size of this bearing based upon some other values within this assembly. So why would I even want to bring in or out an iPart? Well, that's because it really has to do mostly with the benefits of representing a level of accuracy and quality within our designs. And what do I mean by that? So previously, before iLogic really, well, maybe towards the beginning of when iLogic was created and design automation really started taking off, the way to create different configurations was by using level of detail representations. So what a lot of the time what people would do with their level of details, they would create a lot of different level of details, and they would, what I call, they would overload their assembly, where they have every possible scenario, all the components that would satisfy those different scenarios within a single assembly, and then they just simply turn on and off those files in which they need to represent that particular configuration. So very much like iAssemblies, but people would leverage level of detail to do the same thing, okay? And then if they need a different configuration, they would just activate a different level of detail. Well, it makes perfect sense. However, once again, we have to take into consideration every scenario and every possibility, and then everything is dependent upon this one assembly. So if you want to use it, you got to go to this assembly, typically would make it as a template, and then you do a save copy as or whatever, and then make your configuration, okay? So that was what I call overloading in an assembly. Well, with iLogic and leveraging the Inventor API, well, a better way of doing that is just to bring in those components that you need for a particular configuration and don't worry about anything else. Only include those things that are of relevance or those things that are important. So if I need a pulley of a particular size, I would then go out to my repository, bring in that pulley, and then place it where it needs to be relative to everything else within that assembly. So only bring in what you need. And then if you don't need that one anymore, remove it and then bring in the other one that you need. So, and that's a better method, because now, once again, your configuration only includes that information that is of any importance. You're not dealing with everything else. You don't have to worry about having all these files included and suppressed or anything like that. So going back to iLogic, that's why we even have this section of snippets available. Is I want to just bring in that information that is of importance to me. It just so happens that that may be an iPart or may be an iAssembly. So it's just to give you as users more flexibility in terms of your capability for your design. So it doesn't necessarily mean that's the best way or the worst way. It just means you have that availability to be able to do something like that. So if you want to talk about, in my opinion, the best way of doing it, I'm never a fan of overloading. I'm a fan of use your logic, properly define what your functionality should be, and then just bring in those components that are necessary for your design. All right. Going back over here to my PowerPoint. So there's some iLogic support for iParts and iAssemblies, where I can go, and if I have an iPart currently existing within my design, I can change or access information from iPart at any time. As well as if I need to add an iPart from my repository, from my parts library, if you will, I can just go out there, grab it, bring it in, locate it, and then I can control it from there if necessary.